Charleston, July 1822. Denmark Vesey stood on the gallows, a rope biting into his neck. Once enslaved, then freed by chance, he had dared to dream of burning Charleston to the ground and leading thousands to freedom. But betrayal struck before a single torch was lit. At dawn, the city watched in silence as Vessy swung. His rebellion never began, yet his death carved a wound in Charleston, a warning, and a ghost that never slept. The story of Denmark Vesey begins far from Charleston, in the Caribbean waters of the 18th century. Born around 1767 on the island of St. Thomas, he entered the world not as a child of destiny, but as a boy sold into the machinery of empire. Ships carried sugar, rum, and bodies, and Vesey was one of them. He was purchased by Captain Joseph Vessy, a slaver who trafficked in human cargo between Africa, the Caribbean, and the American South. For most enslaved children, this meant anonymity, a name erased as soon as it was spoken. But Denmark Vesey was different. Even in childhood, he displayed a sharp mind, a memory that could hold entire verses of the Bible or fragments of languages overheard at the docks. Charleston, South Carolina, became his new home. It was a city of contradiction, wealth built on rice and cotton plantations, power flaunted in grand townhouses, and fear whispered in every parlor. For in Charleston, the enslaved outnumbered the free. The white population lived in constant anxiety, clinging to whips and chains not only to control bodies, but to silence possibility. In this world, Vessy was caught between two identities. To the law, he was property. To himself, he was something more. He listened, he learned. He noticed the inconsistencies of those who preached Christianity, yet wielded cruelty. He watched how masters spoke of liberty while holding men in bondage. In the slave quarters, whispers of Africa lingered, names of kings, fragments of rituals, echoes of dignity. In the churches, voices read from Exodus, telling of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Vessy absorbed it all, carrying inside him the seeds of a belief that bondage was not destiny, but defiance, waiting to bloom. He was a child of two worlds, the brutal commerce of slavery and the restless current of freedom that stirred beneath it. And though no one could see it then, the boy, taken from St. Thomas, would one day turn Charleston's fear into prophecy. By 1799, Denmark Vesey was no longer just another face in Charleston's enslaved population. Fortune, strange and rare, had brushed his life. That year, a local lottery offered a chance at riches. Against impossible odds, Vesey's ticket struck, $1,500. He used the winnings with precision. For $600, he bought his freedom. On paper, he was no longer a slave. In reality, the chains only loosened, they did not break. His wife and children remained enslaved, property of another man. Vessy walked the streets of Charleston as a free man, yet at night returned to a house where freedom stopped at his doorstep. With freedom came opportunity. He became a carpenter, and not just any carpenter. His skill in shaping wood turned him into one of the most respected craftsmen in the city. Houses bore his mark, beams smoothed by his hands, doors hung straight, furniture balanced with grace. In the white neighborhoods, he was tolerated, even quietly admired for his work. Among the black community, he was a figure of authority, a living symbol that freedom, however fragile, was possible. Yet Vessy was restless. He understood the cruel arithmetic of Charleston's society. His earnings as a carpenter gave him comfort, but not peace. What value was his liberty when his family remained enslaved? What dignity was there in bowing politely to white clients, knowing that one word from them could undo his livelihood? He began to read more deeply, especially the Bible. Verses about justice and deliverance took on new weight. He studied the American Revolution, the grand rhetoric of liberty that filled Charleston's very air. He knew the city celebrated independence from Britain, yet denied it to those whose hands built its wealth. At night, his workshop became more than a place for shaping wood. It became a place for shaping thought. Neighbors gathered, friends listened, and Vessy spoke quietly of a God who did not distinguish between slave and master. He reminded them that Haiti, once enslaved like them, had risen in fire and won freedom. Charleston slept uneasily, though it did not know why. Beneath the rhythm of saws and hammers, Denmark Vesey was building more than homes. He was building conviction. Charleston, in the early 19th century, was a city draped in wealth and shadow. Rice and cotton filled its warehouses, Fine fabrics draped across the shoulders of its elites, and white-columned mansions rose like monuments to prosperity. Yet beneath every polished floorboard and every manicured garden lay the truth. This city was built by hands in chains. By 1820, Charleston's population was majority black. Enslaved people outnumbered whites by nearly 2-to-1. To any observer, this imbalance was both power and peril. The entire Southern economy rested on their labor, but the entire Southern psyche trembled at their potential. Fear of rebellion haunted Charleston's nights more than any storm. The city's leaders fortified their world with rituals of control. Slave patrols stalked the streets after sunset, armed with muskets and suspicion. Church gatherings of black congregants were watched, restricted, sometimes banned. Yet the same masters who feared uprising also sought comfort in religion. On Sundays, they filled pews and listened to sermons about liberty, while enslaved people stood at the back, absorbing verses twisted to justify bondage. It was here that Vesey's disillusionment deepened. As a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, he saw a space where enslaved and free black Charlestonians gathered beyond white control. Within those walls, the words of Exodus rang differently, not as a metaphor, but as a promise: "Let my people go." Charleston's ruling class, however, saw danger. Every prayer spoken in that church, every hymn that rose into the rafters, carried the echo of something larger. It was not just worship, it was memory, resistance, survival. By day, the city glittered. By night, it whispered. Plantation owners fretted over rumors of insurrection. Mothers clutched their children when a stranger's shadow passed too close, and guards tightened their patrols. Yet no watchman could guard against the most dangerous weapon: belief. Charleston slept uneasily because the lie on which it stood, freedom for some, bondage for others, was fragile. And Denmark Vesey had begun to see just how fragile it truly was. Inside the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Vesey's words took root like sparks in dry grass. He was not a fiery orator in the sense of spectacle. Instead, he spoke with calm conviction, weaving the Bible into the lived reality of his people. To enslaved men and women who carried chains in their very muscles, he spoke of Moses, who defied Pharaoh. He spoke of David, who toppled Goliath. He spoke of a God who had no respect of persons, a God who weighed no man by color or status. The message was radical because it was simple. Slavery was sin, and freedom was divine. Gatherings were small, whispered, careful. A carpenter's shop by day became a sanctuary by night. Men and women bent over wooden benches, listening in silence, as Vessy laid out not only scripture but possibility. He reminded them of Haiti, where enslaved people had risen in arms against their masters and against all odds, had won. If Haiti could burn away its chains, why not Charleston? His words traveled quietly but swiftly, carried from workshop to kitchen, from dockside to cabin. They passed through the hands of trusted allies, many of them leaders in Charleston's black community, both free and enslaved. Slowly, a network formed. Vesey was meticulous. He understood that faith alone could not topple a city armed with guns and patrols. Strategy was needed. He began mapping the city in his mind: which houses could be torched, which roads blocked, which ships could carry them to freedom. And always, he pointed toward the same beacon: Haiti. The plan was bold, even audacious. Thousands would rise on a single night, kill their masters, set Charleston aflame, and sail across the sea to join a black republic that had proven liberty could be seized. But before the plan, there was belief, and Vessy nurtured it carefully, like a hidden flame. He gave men who were beaten hope, and women whose children were sold a vision of justice. In the silence of Charleston's nights, while the city pretended to sleep, seeds were being planted, seeds that could one day split the very ground beneath it. By 1821, Vessy's vision was no longer a whisper, but a design. The plan was clear, dangerous, and immense. He gathered trusted men, each responsible for a small circle of followers. In the shadows of Charleston's workshops and cabins, he revealed the outline. Thousands of enslaved people would rise as one, armed not with muskets but with what they had: axes, knives, farming tools, sheer numbers, and faith. The target was Charleston itself. The city would be struck on a Sunday night, when white families slept after church. Fires would ignite in every corner, flames climbing wooden houses, choking streets with smoke. Panic would scatter the guards, masters and mistresses would be dragged from their beds. Once the city was burning, the path to freedom opened. Vesey spoke of ships waiting in the harbor. With Charleston in chaos, they would seize vessels and sail south, across the Caribbean waters, to Haiti. There, a black republic born of revolution promised sanctuary. Haiti had shown the world that the enslaved could rise, fight, and rule themselves. Vessy dreamed his people could follow the same path. The scale was staggering. As many as 9,000 men and women were said to be willing to fight. For every weapon they lacked, they held determination. And for every wall the city raised, they had fire. The plan spread through coded messages and symbols. A word in a hymn, a mark left on a doorframe, a glance exchanged at the marketplace, each signal a thread in the web Vesey wove. To his followers, it felt unstoppable. For once, they would not be sold, beaten, or silenced. For once, history itself would bend. But Charleston was not blind. Whispers stirred unease among the white elite, who already lived in fear of rebellion. And in the fragile architecture of Vesey's plan, one crack could shatter everything. The betrayal came quietly, as betrayals often do. Among the men Vesey trusted, not all were willing to risk everything. Fear was heavy, and for some, the promise of freedom could not outweigh the threat of the noose. 2 enslaved men, tempted by reward and the faint hope of leniency, carried the secret to their masters. Their words were like sparks to dry powder. The authorities listened, horrified, as the scope of the plot unfolded. 9,000 slaves, fire in every street, families murdered in their beds to the white imagination. It was not rebellion, it was apocalypse. Charleston's leaders acted swiftly. The city's militia mobilized, armed patrols doubled, and curfews tightened. Suspected rebels were seized and interrogated. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, once a refuge of faith and hope, was shuttered. For Vesey, the betrayal was devastating. He had built his plan on trust in men who yearned for the same liberty. But in the end, fear proved the stronger chain. The rebellion was stopped before it began. No flames lit the Charleston sky, no ships sailed for Haiti. Instead, silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Yet silence did not mean peace. For white Charlestonians, the revelation of the plot confirmed their deepest nightmares. They saw in Vesey's plan the proof that their entire world stood on a fault line. For the enslaved, the betrayal was more than the loss of a chance. It was the death of a dream spoken aloud. As arrests spread, Vesey's name moved like a shadow through the streets. Some whispered it with awe, others with fear. To his followers, he was a prophet who had dared to imagine the impossible. To his enemies, he was a criminal, proof that black freedom meant white ruin. Betrayal had turned a plan into a memory, but memories, once planted, could not be erased. The night chosen for the uprising arrived like a held breath. Sunday, the 16th of June, 1822. The air in Charleston was heavy, the kind of summer heat that pressed against the skin and refused to lift. Behind shuttered windows, white families slept in comfort, unaware that the city teetered on the edge of something it had always feared. But the rebellion never came. Hours before the signal could be given, the betrayal had already spread through Charleston like poison. The militia, armed and alert, filled the streets. Patrols moved in silence, lanterns bobbing through alleys, hunting for signs of gathering. Every creak of a door, every figure moving in the dark, drew suspicion. Vesey's followers waited for the sign of fire that never appeared. Some gripped axes and knives, crouched in the corners of cabins, their hearts pounding. Others clutched their children, torn between hope and terror. But instead of flames, they saw soldiers. Instead of freedom, they saw chains. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, once the heart of the plan, was raided. Its doors slammed shut, its pews left empty. Vesey's network unraveled as men were dragged from their homes, bound, and marched into the night. Silence, once their shield, had become their prison. Charleston did not wake to fire, but to dread. Rumors of the conspiracy swept through the city with the speed of panic. Some said thousands had gathered with weapons. Others whispered that Haiti's armies were on the way. None of it was true, yet the fear was real enough to choke the city. The rebellion had been crushed before it began, smothered not by fire but by fear. For Vessy, the night was a ghost, a vision of what could have been, broken before the first blow. The city returned to its uneasy sleep, but its dreams would never be the same. In the weeks that followed, Charleston transformed into a courtroom without walls. The accused were everywhere in jails, in makeshift holding rooms, under the eyes of guards who trembled with both power and fear. Vessy himself was among them, arrested on the 22nd of June. The trials were not trials in any true sense. They were secret, closed to the public, with no defense attorneys, no witnesses called in their favor. Testimonies were extracted from the accused and twisted into confessions. To the authorities, this was not justice, it was containment, a show of control meant to smother the spark of rebellion. Vesey faced the tribunal with calm defiance. He denied nothing of his belief in freedom, yet he revealed little that could condemn his followers further. Observers would later remark that he carried himself with dignity, unbroken, even as his fate was sealed. To the white court, this was insolence. To his followers, it was courage. In all, over 130 men were arrested. Of these, 67 were convicted. 35 were sentenced to death by hanging, including Vessy. 31 others were exiled, sold back into the machinery of slavery, far from Charleston's walls. The city kept the proceedings hidden, fearful that the truth might inspire more than it silenced. Yet whispers escaped. In slave quarters, people spoke of Vesey standing tall before his judges. They spoke of men who would rather die than betray their brothers. They spoke of courage, even in chains. Charleston's leaders congratulated themselves on averting catastrophe. They believed they had killed not only a man but an idea, yet the very secrecy of the trial ensured the opposite. By hiding Vesey's voice, they made it echo louder in rumor and memory. The trial ended in silence, but silence is never empty. It holds weight, and in Charleston, that weight pressed down on both the enslaved and the free. It was the silence of justice denied, of dreams deferred, of a people told to bow their heads yet remembering a man who refused. The 2nd of July, 1822. The summer sun beat down on Charleston, but the air was heavier than heat. Crowds gathered near the gallows, some driven by fear, others by curiosity, and a few quietly, secretly by grief. Denmark Vesey was led out among his condemned brothers. 35 men in all were sentenced to hang, their bodies offered as warnings to anyone who dared to dream of freedom. Guards ringed the scene, muskets at the ready, as though even the condemned might still rise. Vessy walked with measured steps. Witnesses would later describe his composure, a calmness that unsettled the very men who bound him. He did not beg, he did not cry. In that silence, he seemed to proclaim what words could not, that his death was not an end, but a testament. The rope was placed around his neck. The crowd hushed, waiting. For the enslaved who looked on from the edges, it was agony to watch a man who had carried their hopes become an example meant to crush them. For the white elites, it was reassurance that their city was safe, their order preserved. But safety came at a price. Charleston would forever carry the memory of that day, when the gallows became both a weapon and a mirror. The city silenced Vesey's dream with a rope, yet it could not silence the echo. When the trapdoor opened, Charleston gasped as one. Vesey's body swung, lifeless, against the sky. There was no grave to mark his resting place, no ceremony to honor his courage. His name was meant to fade into ash and silence. And yet, in whispers and in prayers, it did not. The gallows claimed his body, but not his legacy. Denmark Vesey's rebellion never ignited, yet its embers endured. For decades, Southern historians painted him as a villain, a conspirator, a threat to civilized order. But among the enslaved, his name lived differently, as a man who dared to dream of freedom large enough to swallow a city. In the 20th century, as civil rights leaders searched for voices to reclaim, Vesey's story returned. Monuments were raised, streets renamed, and his church, once shuttered, stood again as a beacon. Charleston still remembers him with unease, torn between fear of what he planned and recognition of why he planned it. But history is clear. Vesey did not live to see freedom, yet he showed that freedom was worth more than life itself. And so, while Charleston slept, Vesey dreamed a dream that no rope, no silence, no betrayal could ever truly kill.